Dust in Defiance. The Wild West whispers secrets in the wind, tales of outlaws and redemption carried on the dust of forgotten trails. Clara James arrived in Dusty Creek, a seamstress with a shadowed past, her hands stained by more than thread. Once known as Rose Thorn, she rode with the ruthless Blackthorn Gang, a name feared across the frontier. Now, beneath a merciless sky, she sought a new beginning, hiding a wanted poster and a heart heavy with guilt. But the echoes of gunfire and betrayal weren't far behind. A black feather fell at her feet, a chilling omen of a past that wouldn't let go. In this rugged town, where danger lurked in every shadow, Clara's fight for a second chance was about to begin. The dust was rising, and with it, a storm of vengeance. Chapter 1. New Seams, Old Scars. The stagecoach rattled to a halt, spitting dust and weary travelers onto the uneven main street of Dusty Creek. Clara James stepped down, her worn leather satchel clutched tightly in one hand, the other smoothing the wrinkles from her travel-stained blue dress. It wasn't a fancy dress, not anymore, but it was sturdy, practical, just like she intended to be from now on. Dusty Creek was, by all appearances, a speck of civilization clinging precariously to the edge of a vast, unforgiving wilderness. Buildings, mostly weathered wood, lined the street, their false fronts striving for a grandeur they didn't quite possess. A saloon, its doors already swinging despite the early hour, promised a temporary escape from the harsh realities of frontier life. A general store, a blacksmith's shop, its hammer ringing a steady rhythm, and a small, unassuming building with a freshly painted sign, Clara's Stitches Alterations in Fine Garments. Her shop. Clara took a deep breath, the scent of dust, horse manure, and something faintly floral wildflowers perhaps, clinging stubbornly to life in window boxes filling her lungs. This was it, a fresh start, a chance to outrun the ghosts that clung to her like the persistent prairie dust. She was 22, though the lines around her eyes, etched by hardship and sleepless nights, made her look older. Her hands, calloused from more than just needlework, betrayed a past she desperately wanted to bury. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man with eyes that had seen too much, grunted as he tossed her trunk to the ground. "Dusty Creek," he announced, his voice raspy. "End of the line for some, beginning for others." He looked at Clara, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, before spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the street. Clara ignored the unspoken question in his eyes. She was used to it. The wary looks, the whispers. She hoisted her trunk, ignoring the twinge in her shoulder, a souvenir from a night she'd rather forget, and headed towards her shop. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped inside. The air was close, smelling of fresh paint and wood shavings. A single shaft of sunlight pierced through the front window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. It was small, sparsely furnished, but it was hers. She set the trunk down with a thud, the sound echoing in the silence. A small, scarred wooden counter stood near the front, a bolt of calico fabric draped across it. Behind it, a narrow doorway led to a back room, where a cot and a wash basin promised a meager, but private, existence. This was more than she'd had in months. More than she deserved, a small, insistent voice whispered in the back of her mind. Clara ran a hand over the counter, the rough wood a stark contrast to the smooth, cool metal of the small derringer hidden in the pocket of her skirt. It was a habit, this constant awareness of the weapon, a reflex born from a life lived on the edge. She hadn't used it since Blackthorn. But old habits died hard, especially in a place like Dusty Creek. She unpacked her satchel, placing its meager contents on the counter. A small sewing kit, meticulously organized, a few precious coins wrapped in a handkerchief, and a worn leather-bound book of poetry, a surprising memento of a life she tried to leave behind. The poetry was a secret indulgence, a reminder of a gentler world that seemed a million miles away. Finally, she pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges softened with age and handling. It was a wanted poster, crudely drawn, depicting a young woman with dark hair and defiant eyes. The name beneath the sketch, Rose Thorn, her name, or at least the name she'd used when she rode with the Blackthorn Gang. Clara stared at the poster, her heart a cold knot in her chest. She'd found it tucked away in her belongings weeks ago, a stark reminder of the price on her head, the danger that still shadowed her. She'd thought of burning it, but something, a perverse sense of defiance perhaps, or a morbid fascination, had made her keep it. A sudden noise, the jingle of spurs, the murmur of voices brought her back to the present. Clara quickly folded the poster and tucked it away, her hand instinctively moving to the derringer in her pocket. She smoothed her hair, forcing a calm expression onto her face. It wouldn't do to look like a frightened rabbit. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of her first customer. A woman, stout and matronly, with a stern face and a basket overflowing with mending, stood in the doorway. "You Clara James?" she asked, her voice sharp and assessing. Clara swallowed, forcing a smile. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Welcome to Clara's Stitches." The woman stepped inside, her eyes scanning the small shop, taking in every detail. "Heard you were new in town," she said, placing the basket on the counter with a thump. "Need some mending done. Husband's ripped his good trousers again, clumsy oaf. And the little ones, well, they're always tearing something." "I can certainly help with that," Clara said, relief washing over her. A simple request, a normal task, a chance to blend in, to become just another face in Dusty Creek. The woman continued to scrutinize her, her gaze lingering on Clara's hands. "You got a steady hand, girl?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. "These are good clothes. Can't have them ruined by some amateur." Clara met her gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "I assure you, ma'am, I'm very experienced," she said, her voice laced with a quiet confidence that belied the turmoil within. She picked up a pair of the ripped trousers, her fingers expertly examining the tear. "This is a simple fix. Good quality fabric, too. I can have it back to you by tomorrow." The woman seemed satisfied, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. See that you do. Name's Martha Higgins. My husband runs the general store." Clara nodded, committing the name to memory. Dusty Creek was a small town. Every connection mattered. Every reputation, good or bad, would spread like wildfire. As Martha Higgins continued to list her mending needs, Clara listened attentively, making notes, her mind already calculating the time and materials required. But beneath the surface of this ordinary transaction, a deeper fear churned. She was playing a role, pretending to be someone she wasn't, and every interaction, every new acquaintance was a risk. Later that evening, after Mrs. Higgins had departed, Clara sat alone in her shop, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. The town outside was quieting down, the sounds of the saloon fading into the distance. She'd lit a single lamp, its flickering flame illuminating the small space, casting her own shadow, large and distorted on the wall. She picked up the worn book of poetry, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. It was a gift, a long time ago, from a man she'd once thought she loved. A man who, like her, had been caught up in the whirlwind of violence and lawlessness that defined the Blackthorn gang. A wave of sadness washed over her, a familiar ache that she'd tried to suppress for months. She opened the book, her eyes scanning the familiar verses, searching for a solace she knew she wouldn't find. The words blurred, her vision clouded by unshed tears. Suddenly, a sharp rap on the door startled her. Clara jumped, her hand instinctively reaching for the derringer. She quickly closed the book, her heart pounding in her chest. Who would be calling on her at this hour? She took a deep breath, composing herself before opening the door a crack. Standing on the porch, silhouetted against the fading light, was a tall, broad-shouldered figure. The brim of his hat shadowed his face, but she could make out the glint of a silver star pinned to his chest. The sheriff. Sheriff Wyatt McAllister, she recalled, hearing whispers of his name around the town that day. He was law in Dusty Creek, and meeting him like that set chills to crawl over her skin. He, too, must have heard of her presence, her new business. He cleared his throat before his deep voice carried across the space. "Miss James?" he inquired, his tone polite but firm. "I'm Sheriff McAllister. Just wanted to welcome you to Dusty Creek. There was something that felt like a warning underneath it all, a promise. Clara's hand tightened around the derringer, her knuckles white. This was it, the moment she dreaded. The past had caught up with her. Or she was just being silly, paranoid. She steadied herself, pasting a friendly mask. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, and took the courage to fully open the door. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dust. The sheriff's presence lingered in the small shop long after he'd tipped his hat and ridden off into the deepening twilight. Clara had offered him a polite, if somewhat strained, thank you, managing to keep her voice even despite the tremor in her hands. He hadn't stayed long, just a few words of welcome, a subtle inquiry about her journey, and a pointed yet unspoken observation about the importance of law and order in Dusty Creek. It was the look in his eyes, though steady, assessing, a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher that had unsettled her the most. She'd closed the door, her back pressed against the wood, her heart still hammering against her ribs. The derringer felt heavy in her pocket, a constant reminder of the life she was trying to escape. She knew she couldn't hide forever. The past had a way of catching up, especially in a place like this, where secrets were as common as dust devils and just as easily stirred up. Clara forced herself to move, to busy herself with the mundane tasks of settling in. She unpacked her trunk, placing her few belongings in the small back room. A simple cot, a wash basin, a chipped mirror on the wall. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was anonymity. For now, at least, she tried to focus on the work. Martha Higgins's mending lay on the counter, a tangible distraction from the anxieties swirling in her mind. She threaded a needle, the familiar motion soothing, and began to work on the ripped trousers. The rhythmic stitch, stitch, stitch was a small act of creation, a way to build something new, even as the old threatened to unravel everything. But the sheriff's visit had stirred up more than just dust. It had awakened the whispers, the nagging doubts that she'd tried so hard to bury. She remembered the faces of the men she'd ridden with, the reckless thrill of the chase, the cold, hard reality of the consequences. She remembered the night it had all gone wrong, the night that had shattered her illusions and sent her running. The images flashed through her mind, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams, the blood staining the dusty ground. The face of a young deputy, his eyes wide with terror, staring up at her as she held a smoking gun. She hadn't pulled the trigger, but she'd been there. She'd been complicit, and that guilt, that heavy weight of responsibility, was something she couldn't outrun. Clara pricked her finger on the needle, a sharp, stinging pain that brought her back to the present. She sucked on the wound, the taste of blood metallic on her tongue. She needed to be careful. She needed to be smart. One slip-up, one careless word, and everything she'd built, this fragile semblance of a new life, could come crashing down. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sun already baking the dusty streets of Dusty Creek. Clara opened her shop early, determined to keep busy, to lose herself in the rhythm of work. She had a few customers throughout the morning, mostly women from the town, bringing in mending or ordering new dresses. She was polite, efficient, her skilled hands making quick work of alterations and repairs. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the bell above the door jingled, her heart would leap into her throat. Every curious glance, every whispered conversation felt like an accusation. She found herself studying the faces of the townspeople, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of suspicion. She learned more about Dusty Creek, too. Snippets of conversation, overheard gossip, revealed the town's undercurrents. There were rivalries between ranchers, simmering resentments, and the ever-present threat of violence that hung heavy in the air. The recent cattle rustlings, mentioned by Martha Higgins, were a major topic of concern. The ranchers were losing livestock, and tensions were running high. Sheriff McAllister, it seemed, had his hands full. Clara listened, careful not to ask too many questions, to appear too interested. She was an outsider, a newcomer, and she needed to tread carefully. But the more she learned, the more she realized that Dusty Creek was not the peaceful haven she'd hoped for. It was a place of secrets and hidden dangers, just like the life she'd left behind. In the afternoon, a young woman, barely more than a girl, came into the shop. She was pretty with bright, curious eyes and a shy smile. She introduced herself as Sarah, the daughter of the town's blacksmith. She brought in a simple dress to be hemmed, but she seemed more interested in talking than in the garment itself. "You're new here, aren't you?" Sarah asked, her voice hesitant. "We don't get many newcomers in Dusty Creek." Clara managed a smile. "Yes, I am," she replied, "just trying to make a fresh start." Sarah nodded, her gaze sympathetic. "It's not always easy," she said. "Dusty Creek can be a hard place." "I'm used to hard places," Clara said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Sarah looked at her, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "What brought you here?" she asked. Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't tell the truth. Not yet. Not to anyone. I needed a change," she said, the words sounding lame even to her own ears. "I heard there was a need for a seamstress." Sarah seemed to accept the explanation, though a hint of doubt lingered in her eyes. They talked for a while longer, about the town, about the weather, about the upcoming dance at the saloon on Saturday night. Sarah was friendly, open, and Clara found herself relaxing, enjoying the simple conversation. It was a reminder that not everyone in Dusty Creek was suspicious, that there was still a chance for connection, for friendship. As Sarah was leaving, she paused at the door. "Sheriff McAllister is a good man," she said, her voice earnest. "He keeps us safe." Clara nodded, her heart tightening. "I'm sure he does," she replied. Sarah smiled again, a bright, hopeful smile. "Maybe I'll see you at the dance," she said. Clara hesitated. The thought of attending a social gathering, of exposing herself to further scrutiny, filled her with apprehension. But she also knew that she couldn't hide away forever. She needed to integrate, to become a part of the community, if she wanted to truly start anew. "Maybe," she said, forcing a smile. "We'll see." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, Clara closed up her shop. She was tired, her mind weary from the constant vigilance, the effort of maintaining her facade. She walked to the back room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The final customer of the day had a request that would tie her up a bit more. As she sat down on the cot, a piece of paper slipped from inside one of her sketchbooks, a sketch she'd started the previous day, hidden for safety. It was the rough draft of the sheriff's features, his eyes, his jaw, the stern set of his mouth. Why was she drawing him? She should be getting as far away from the man as possible, not sketching him. She stared down at the drawing, and a small voice, almost a whisper, rose in her ear. "He knows." Clara glanced at the window, looking out at the deepening dusk, and that's when she saw it. A rider far in the distance, a silhouette against the crimson and gold sky. Watching. Chapter 3. The Sheriff's Gaze. The rider remained a distant, ominous figure, swallowed by the growing darkness. Clara watched, her breath caught in her throat, until the silhouette merged with the night and vanished. Was it just a rancher, returning home late? Or was it someone else? Someone who knew her past, someone connected to Blackthorn. Paranoia, she told herself, was a dangerous companion in a place like Dusty Creek, but the unease lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. She forced herself to turn away from the window, to focus on the mundane. She lit a lamp, the small flame chasing away some of the shadows, but not the ones in her mind. She ate a meager supper of bread and cheese, her appetite diminished by the lingering anxiety. She tried to read, to lose herself in the familiar words of her poetry book, but the lines blurred before her eyes. The sheriff's face, the one she'd sketched, seemed to float in the air before her, his gaze steady and unwavering. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he let on. His polite welcome, his subtle inquiries, The way his eyes seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade, it all pointed to a suspicion that she couldn't ignore. But what could he know? How could he have found out? Clara paced the small room, her mind racing. She needed to be more careful. She needed to be invisible. But how could she be invisible when the sheriff's gaze seemed to follow her everywhere? The next morning, she awoke with a renewed sense of determination. She would not be intimidated. She would not be driven away. She had come to Dusty Creek to build a new life, and she would not let her past destroy it. She opened her shop, greeting her customers with a forced smile and a cheerful demeanor. She worked diligently, her hands moving swiftly and expertly, mending tears, altering seams, creating new garments. The work was a refuge, a way to keep her mind occupied, to prevent her fears from overwhelming her. But the sheriff was never far from her thoughts. She found herself glancing out the window, expecting to see him riding by, his presence a constant reminder of the precariousness of her situation. Mid-morning he appeared, not on horseback as she'd expected, but on foot, strolling down the dusty street with a casual air that belied the power he held. He paused outside her shop, his gaze meeting hers through the window. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She forced herself to hold his gaze, to project an air of calm indifference. He entered the shop, the bell above the door jingling merrily, a stark contrast to the tension that filled the small space. He removed his hat, holding it in his hands, his eyes scanning the shop, taking in the details. "Miss James," he said, his voice polite but firm, "just checking in, making sure you're settling in all right." "Thank you, Sheriff," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm doing just fine." He nodded, his gaze lingering on a dress she'd been working on, a delicate blue silk gown that was clearly meant for a special occasion. "Nice work," he said. "You have a talent." "Thank you," Clara repeated, her cheeks flushing slightly. She was proud of her work, of the skills she'd honed over the years. It was one of the few things in her life that felt genuine, untainted by the shadows of her past. He moved closer to the counter, his presence filling the small space. He was a large man, not overly muscular, but solid, dependable. His eyes, she noticed, were a startling shade of blue, a sharp contrast to his weathered face and dark hair. There was a hint of weariness in those eyes, a sadness that she recognized, a reflection of the hardships he'd undoubtedly witnessed in his line of work. "Dusty Creek can be a tough town, Miss James," he said, his voice low. "We've had some trouble lately. Cattle rustlings, ranchers are on edge." Clara nodded, her hands clenching into fists. She knew all about cattle rustlings. She'd been a part of them, once upon a time. "I've heard," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We're doing our best to track down the culprits," he continued, his gaze fixed on her face. "But it's not easy. They're clever. They know the land." Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold it without flinching. "I'm sure you'll catch them, Sheriff," she said. "You seem like a capable man." He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I appreciate the vote of confidence, Miss James," he said, "but sometimes even the most capable men need a little help." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Sometimes," he continued, "the smallest piece of information, a seemingly insignificant detail, can make all the difference." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Was he fishing? Was he trying to trap her? She chose her words carefully. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about cattle rustling, Sheriff," she said. "I'm just a seamstress." He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on her face. "Of course," he said. "But you see things, Miss James. You hear things. People talk to you. They trust you." He reached out and touched the blue silk gown, his fingers brushing against the delicate fabric. "This dress," he said, "it's for someone special, isn't it?" Clara hesitated. The dress was for Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter. She was planning to wear it to the dance on Saturday night. She'd confided in Clara, sharing her excitement, her hopes for a romantic evening. "It's for a young woman in town," Clara said, her voice carefully neutral. "She's attending the dance." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "The dance," he repeated, A good opportunity for people to get together, to talk, to share information. He paused, his gaze shifting from the dress to Clara's face. You planning on attending, Miss James? Clara's mind raced. She'd been hesitant before, but now the sheriff's question felt like a challenge, a test. If she refused, it would only arouse further suspicion. But if she went, she'd be exposing herself to scrutiny, to the risk of being recognized. I haven't decided yet, she said, stalling for time. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Well, he said, I hope you do decide to come. It would be a shame for a woman with your talent to miss out on the festivities. He placed his hat back on his head, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer. Thank you for your time, Miss James, he said. I'll let you get back to your work. He turned and walked out of the shop, the bell jingling behind him. Clara stood there, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She felt like a rabbit caught in a snare, every move she made only tightening the trap. She watched him through the window as he walked down the street, his figure tall and imposing. He stopped to talk to a couple of ranchers, his voice low and serious. They listened intently, their faces grim. Clara turned away from the window, her hands trembling. She needed to think. She needed a plan. She couldn't stay in Dusty Creek, not with the sheriff watching her every move. But where could she go? How could she escape? The bell jingled and she almost screamed. It was just Sarah picking up her finished dress. But the fear was there. It was real. Clara felt it down to her bones. She looked at the young girl's trusting face, and a new, unexpected surge went through her. Guilt. It's beautiful, Sarah said, holding the dress with awe. Thank you, Clara. Thank you so much. And those simple words almost undid her. Because as Clara looked at the young girl, so full of life and hope, she felt a small voice, barely a whisper, inside her own heart. Protect her. And the silhouette of a rider flashed through her mind. The rider she had seen last night, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of the sheriff's true intent. He wasn't just watching her. He was watching over Dusty Creek. Chapter 4. Rustler's Moon. The guilt gnawed at Clara, a constant, uncomfortable pressure in her chest. Sarah's innocent gratitude, her trusting smile, felt like an indictment. Clara had been so focused on her own survival, on escaping her past, that she'd forgotten what it was like to care about someone else, to feel responsible for their well-being. The sheriff's subtle probing, his focus on the dance now seemed less about her and more about protecting the town, protecting people like Sarah. The realization shifted something within her. It didn't erase her past, her guilt, but it added a new layer, a new complexity to her situation. She couldn't just run, not this time, not when there were innocent people at risk. The dance was 2 days away, and the town was buzzing with anticipation. Clara continued to work, her hands busy, her mind wrestling with this newfound sense of responsibility. She overheard snippets of conversations, hushed whispers about the rustlers, the growing fear among the ranchers. They were losing more cattle, and the sheriff, despite his efforts, seemed to be one step behind. One evening, as Clara was closing up a shop, Martha Higgins came bustling in, her face flushed with agitation. "Clara, have you heard?" she exclaimed, her voice breathless. "They hit the Miller Ranch last night. Stole half his herd. Poor man's practically ruined." Clara's heart sank. She knew what it was like to lose everything, to be left with nothing but fear and uncertainty. "That's terrible, Martha," she said, her voice sincere. "Is there anything I can do?" Martha shook her head, her eyes filled with worry. "I don't know," she said. "The sheriff's doing all he can, but it's not enough. These rustlers are like ghosts. They come and go in the night, leaving no trace." Ghosts. The word struck a chord within Clara. She knew about ghosts. She was haunted by them. And she knew how to move like a ghost, how to disappear without a trace. It was a skill she'd honed during her time with the Blackthorn gang, a skill she'd hoped to never use again. But now she wondered if that skill, that dark part of her past, could be used for good. Could she use her knowledge of the shadows to help the sheriff, to protect the town? It was a dangerous thought, a reckless idea. It could expose her, ruin everything she'd built. But the image of Sarah's trusting face, the thought of the ranchers losing their livelihoods, kept pushing her towards a decision she knew she might regret. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The moon, full and bright, cast an eerie glow over Dusty Creek, illuminating the dusty streets and the silent buildings. It was a rustler's moon, she realized, the kind of night that favored those who moved in the shadows. She got out of bed, her mind made up. She couldn't stand idly by while innocent people suffered. She had to do something, even if it meant risking everything. She dressed in dark clothing, discarding her usual attire for a pair of sturdy trousers and a dark shirt, clothes that would allow her to blend in with the night. She pulled on her boots, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't done anything like this in months, and the old fear, the adrenaline rush, was a potent mixture. She took the Derringer from its hiding place, checking the load, the cold metal of familiar weight in her hand. She hoped she wouldn't have to use it, but she wouldn't hesitate if she had to. She slipped out of her shop, the door creaking softly behind her. The town was silent, asleep, unaware of the danger that lurked in the shadows. She moved quickly, keeping to the alleyways, her senses on high alert. She was a shadow among shadows, a ghost in the night. She headed towards the outskirts of town, towards the open range where the ranches were spread out. She didn't have a specific plan, just a vague idea of scouting the area, of looking for any sign of the rustlers, any clue that might help the sheriff. She rode for hours, her horse, a sturdy mare she'd bought from the livery stable, moving silently across the dusty terrain. The moon was her only guide, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted with every movement. She saw nothing, heard nothing, but the silence itself was unsettling. It was the kind of silence that preceded a storm, the kind of silence that hid a deadly threat. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of pink and orange, Clara was about to give up, to return to town, when she saw it. A faint flicker of light in the distance, a small campfire nestled among a cluster of rocks. Her heart pounded in her chest. It could be nothing, just a couple of cowboys camping out. But her instincts told her otherwise. It was too close to the Miller Ranch, too hidden, too secretive. She dismounted, tying her horse to a nearby tree, and approached the campfire on foot, moving slowly, cautiously, every sense on high alert. She kept to the shadows, using the rocks and the sparse vegetation for cover. As she got closer, she could hear voices, low murmurs, hushed conversations. She crept closer, her hand on the Derringer, her breath held tight in her chest. She peered around a large boulder, and what she saw made her blood run cold. 3 men were sitting around the campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were rough-looking men, hard-faced, with the unmistakable air of outlaws, and they were dividing up their spoils. Money. Lots of it. More than could possibly explain with any honest job. Clara recognized one of the men. He was a local, a ranch hand who worked for one of the smaller ranches in the area. She'd seen him in town, a quiet, unassuming man, someone she'd never have suspected of being involved in anything illegal. But the other 2 men, they were strangers, and she recognized the cold, hard look in their eyes. She'd seen it before, in the faces of the Blackthorn gang. One of the men rose with a stretched yawn. "All right, boys, time we moved it along. Sheriff's gonna be sniffing for us by dawn." The other man grunted. "He ain't gonna find nothing. We're too slick for him." Clara's hand tightened around the Derringer. She had to do something. She had to stop them. But she couldn't take on 3 men alone, not without risking her life. She needed to get back to town, to warn the sheriff. The local looked at the other 2 and gave a sinister smile. "And once we're done with that dance and that pretty little seamstress, we'll vanish." Clara's blood turned into ice. She had to act, and she had to act now. Chapter 5. Shadows of Blackthorn. The threat against Sarah, against herself, galvanized Clara. The casual cruelty in the ranch hand's voice, the predatory gleam in his eyes, erased any lingering doubts, any hesitation. These weren't just cattle rustlers. They were predators, and they had to be stopped. She slipped back into the shadows, her mind racing. She couldn't confront them directly. Not yet. She needed to get back to Dusty Creek, to warn Sheriff McAllister. But she couldn't just leave them either. They'd be gone by the time she returned with the sheriff, vanished into the vast wilderness. She needed to slow them down, to buy herself some time, and she knew just how to do it. Clara moved quickly, silently, her movements honed by years of practice. She circled around the campfire, keeping to the shadows, her eyes scanning the terrain. She found what she was looking for: the horses. They were tethered to a small copse of trees, a short distance from the campfire. She approached the horses cautiously, her hand outstretched, murmuring softly, reassuringly. She'd always had a way with animals, a knack for calming them, for gaining their trust. It was a skill that had served her well in her former life, and it served her well now. She reached the horses, her fingers gently stroking their necks, their flanks. They were restless, sensing the tension in the air. But they responded to her touch, to her soothing voice. She worked quickly, efficiently, her fingers nimble and sure. She didn't slash the saddle cinches, didn't want to injure the animals. Instead, she loosened them, just enough to make them unreliable, to ensure that they would slip at the first sign of hard riding. It was a subtle act of sabotage, one that wouldn't be immediately obvious, but one that would have significant consequences. She finished her work, her heart pounding in her chest. She patted each horse one last time, then slipped back into the shadows, melting away into the pre-dawn gloom. She retrieved her own horse, mounted, and rode hard back towards Dusty Creek, the rising sun at her back. The image of the rustlers' faces, the sound of their voices, the threat hanging in the air, spurred her on. She arrived in town just as the first rays of sunlight were painting the sky with vibrant hues of orange and gold. The streets were still mostly deserted, the town slowly awakening from its slumber. She rode straight to the sheriff's office, her horse's hooves clattering on the wooden boardwalk. She dismounted, her legs stiff from the hard ride, and burst through the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sheriff McAllister was sitting at his desk, sipping coffee, his face etched with weariness. He looked up, surprised, his eyes widening as he saw her standing there, disheveled, her face pale, her eyes wide with urgency. "Miss James," he said, his voice sharp. "What's wrong?" Clara struggled to catch her breath, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. "The rustlers," she gasped. "I found them, camped out near the Miller Ranch. 3 of them. One's a local, a ranch hand. The other 2, they're dangerous, Sheriff. They talked about the dance, about hurting people." She couldn't bring up her name. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. He set down his coffee cup, the sound loud in the sudden silence. "Where?" he demanded, his voice curt. "Show me." Clara nodded, her heart still pounding. She led him outside, pointing in the direction of the Miller Ranch. "Out that way," she said, "near a cluster of rocks. They had a campfire." The sheriff didn't waste any time. He shouted for his deputy, a young, eager man named Billy, and within minutes they were mounted and riding hard, following Clara's lead. As they rode, Clara recounted what she'd seen, what she'd heard, her voice trembling slightly as she described the rustlers' faces, their casual cruelty, their threat against the town. The sheriff listened intently, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't question her, didn't doubt her, but she could sense the tension in him, the urgency of the situation. They reached the spot where Clara had seen the campfire, but it was cold, the ashes scattered by the wind. The rustlers were gone. Clara's heart sank. Had she been too late? Had they escaped? But the sheriff, his eyes scanning the ground, noticed something. The tracks, they were fresh, but they were confused, chaotic. and then he sawed a saddle lying discarded on the ground, its cinch broken. He examined the cinch, his fingers tracing the loosened straps. They didn't get far, he said, his voice low. Something spooked them. Or someone. He looked at Clara, his eyes searching, questioning. He knew. He knew she'd done something, that she'd somehow interfered with their escape. Clara met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. She didn't say anything, didn't offer any explanation. She didn't need to. The sheriff nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding, of respect in his eyes. "Let's go," he said, his voice grim. "They can't be far." They followed the tracks, the trail leading them deeper into the rugged terrain, towards the foothills of the mountains. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, the heat intensifying, the tension mounting with every passing moment. Clara rode beside the sheriff, her past and present colliding. The skills she'd honed as a member of the Blackthorn gang, the skills she'd tried to bury, were now being used to protect the innocent, to fight for justice. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, this blurring of the lines between right and wrong, between outlaw and law-abiding citizen. But it was also strangely exhilarating, a sense of purpose, of redemption, that she hadn't felt in a long time. As they rode, a sudden chilling thought struck her. The two strangers, the ones she'd recognized as outlaws, they reminded her of someone specific from the Blackthorn gang, someone particularly ruthless. And as the pieces finally fell into place, Clara realized that the shadows of Blackthorn had not just followed her. They had caught up. Chapter 6. A Stitch in Time. The realization that the rustlers might be connected to the Blackthorn gang sent a shiver of dread down Clara's spine. It wasn't just her past catching up. It was her worst nightmare resurfacing. She'd hoped to leave that life behind, to bury it deep, but it seemed the ghosts of Blackthorn were not so easily dismissed. She glanced at Sheriff McAllister, riding beside her, his face set in grim determination. She hadn't told him about her past, about her connection to the notorious gang. She'd been too afraid, too ashamed. But now, with the stakes so high, with the lives of innocent people on the line, she knew she couldn't keep silent any longer. But how to tell him? How to confess the truth without losing his trust, without becoming a target herself? They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves, the occasional screech of a hawk circling overhead. The terrain was becoming rougher, the trail leading them into a narrow canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side. "Sheriff," Clara began, her voice hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you." He turned his head, his blue eyes questioning, but he didn't interrupt. "Those men," she continued, "the two strangers, I think I know them, or at least I know of them." He reined in his horse, his gaze intensifying. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confession. They remind me of men I used to know. Men from the Blackthorn gang." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but she could sense the sudden tension in him, the shift in his perception of her. He didn't say anything, just waited for her to continue. I used to ride with them," she confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "A long time ago, before I came to Dusty Creek." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken questions, with judgment, with the weight of her past. Finally, the sheriff spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "You were a member of the Blackthorn gang?" he asked, the question more of a statement, a confirmation of what he already suspected. Clara nodded, her head bowed, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," she whispered, "but I left. I wanted a different life. I wanted to be better." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching, assessing. She could see the conflict in his gaze, the struggle between his duty as a lawman and the trust he'd begun to place in her. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice still low but with a hint of something else. Disappointment? Betrayal? I was afraid, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Afraid of what you'd think, afraid of what would happen. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening slightly. I understand, he said, but you should have told me. I know, she said, but I'm telling you now, and I'm telling you this, those men, if they are who I think they are, they're dangerous. They won't hesitate to kill. The sheriff's expression hardened again, his focus shifting back to the task at hand. We need to stop them, he said, before they hurt anyone else. He urged his horse forward, and Clara followed, her heart heavy with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She'd confessed her past, and he hadn't immediately arrested her, hadn't turned his back on her. But she knew she still had much to prove, much to atone for. They continued to follow the tracks, the canyon narrowing, the walls closing in. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the occasional crack of a twig, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Suddenly the sheriff held up his hand, signaling her to stop. He dismounted, his movements quick and silent, and motioned for her to do the same. He pointed to the ground, to a set of fresh tracks, clearly visible in the soft earth. They're close, he whispered. We need to be careful. They proceeded on foot, leading their horses, their steps slow and deliberate. The canyon twisted and turned, the walls rising higher, casting long shadows that obscured their vision. They heard it, then a faint sound, the murmur of voices, the clink of metal. The rustlers were just ahead. The sheriff drew his revolver, his face grim. Clara reached for the derringer in her pocket, her hand trembling slightly. She hadn't used a gun in months, but the feel of it, the weight of it, was instantly familiar. They crept forward, their senses on high alert, their bodies tense with anticipation. They rounded a bend in the canyon, and there they were. The three rustlers were standing in a small clearing, their horses nearby. They were arguing, their voices raised in anger. The local ranch hand was gesturing wildly, his face red with frustration. The two strangers were watching him, their expressions cold and menacing. I told you, we should have gotten rid of her, the ranch hand was saying, his voice shaking. She saw us, she knows who we are. One of the strangers stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his knife. Shut your mouth, he growled. We'll deal with her, after the dance. Clara's blood ran cold. They were still planning to attack the town, to target Sarah, to target her. The sheriff stepped out into the clearing, his revolver aimed, his voice calm but deadly. Hold it right there, he said. You're under arrest. The rustlers whirled around, their eyes widening in surprise. They hadn't expected to be found, to be confronted. The standoff was brief, tense, but ultimately decisive. The ranch hand, panicked and desperate, tried to draw his gun, but the sheriff was faster. A shot rang out, echoing through the canyon, and the ranch hand crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The two strangers, realizing they were outgunned, hesitated. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. One was the spitting image of her old flame, a cruel man. And as she met his eyes, Clara felt deep down a small, hard knot of the past come undone. Drop your weapons, the sheriff ordered, his voice unwavering. Slowly, reluctantly, the two strangers lowered their guns, their hands raised in surrender. Clara, her hand stepped forward, and she took the guns. It was over. Or was it? Clara, with the two outlaws, had a strange sense of elation, like justice had been served, but her task had just begun. Chapter 7, Beneath a Wary Sky. The immediate threat was neutralized, the rustlers disarmed and subdued. But the tension didn't dissipate, it merely shifted, taking on a different form. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of Clara's past hanging heavy between her and Sheriff McAllister. They had apprehended the criminals, but the repercussions of that capture, of Clara's involvement, were yet to be fully realized. They secured the rustlers, binding their hands and feet with rope. The ranch hand, whose name was revealed to be Jed, was groaning in pain, clutching his wounded shoulder. The sheriff tended to his injury, his movements efficient but not gentle. He was a lawman first, and compassion came second. The two strangers, silent and sullen, watched them with cold, resentful eyes. Clara recognized them now with a chilling certainty. They were indeed former associates of the Blackthorn gang, men she'd known, ridden with, shared campfires with. Their names were Bart and Cole, and they were known for their ruthlessness, their lack of empathy. Seeing them again after all this time brought back a flood of memories, a wave of guilt and regret that she tried so hard to suppress. She'd hoped to escape that life, to leave it behind, but here it was, staring her in the face, a stark reminder of the choices she'd made, the person she'd once been. As they prepared to return to Dusty Creek, leading the captured rustlers, the sheriff turned to Clara, his expression unreadable. "You did good, Miss James," he said, his voice low. "You helped us catch them." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I had to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were going to hurt people. He studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching, questioning. He knew there was more to her story, more than she'd revealed. But he didn't press her. Not yet. "We'll talk later," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Back in town, they rode back in silence, the captured rustlers trailing behind them, their horses moving slowly, their heads bowed in defeat. The sun was high in the sky now, the heat intense, the landscape unforgiving. The beauty of the vast open prairie, the rugged mountains in the distance, seemed to mock their situation, to highlight the darkness that had intruded upon their lives. As they approached Dusty Creek, Clara felt a growing sense of apprehension. The townspeople would be relieved, grateful that the rustlers had been caught, but they would also be curious, suspicious about her involvement. How would they react when they learned about her past, about her connection to the Blackthorn gang? The news of the capture spread quickly, as news always did in a small town. People gathered in the streets, their faces a mixture of relief and curiosity. They watched as the sheriff and his deputy, with Clara riding alongside them, escorted the captured rustlers to the jail, a small, sturdy building next to the sheriff's office. Clara could feel their eyes on her, the whispers, the speculation. She kept her head held high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken questions. Martha Higgins, her face pale but relieved, rushed out of the general store, her arms outstretched. "Clara, are you all right?" she exclaimed, her voice filled with concern. We heard what happened." Clara managed a weak smile. "I'm fine, Martha," she said. "They're caught. They won't hurt anyone else." Sarah, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration, stood beside her mother, her gaze fixed on Clara. She didn't say anything, just looked at her, a silent question in her eyes. The sheriff, noticing the gathering crowd, addressed them, his voice loud and clear. "The rustlers have been apprehended," he announced. "They're behind bars where they belong, thanks to the bravery of Miss James, who helped us track them down." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Dusty Creek is safe," he continued. "We can all breathe a little easier now." The crowd erupted in cheers, their relief palpable. They surged forward, congratulating the sheriff, thanking him for his efforts. But their eyes kept drifting back to Clara, their expressions a mixture of awe and suspicion. The sheriff, sensing Clara's discomfort, stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her arm. "Miss James needs some rest," he said, his voice firm. "She's been through a lot." He guided her away from the crowd, towards her shop, his presence a shield against the prying eyes, the whispered questions. As they reached her shop, he turned to her, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said. Inside, Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was it, the moment of truth. She had to tell him everything, to reveal the full extent of her past, to face the consequences of her choices. She unlocked the door, her hand trembling slightly, and stepped inside, the sheriff following close behind. The small shop, usually a haven, a place of peace and creativity, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on her. The setting sun cast long and somber shadows. She looked at Wyatt, the man who had unknowingly offered her sanctuary and now perhaps held her fate in his hands. "It wasn't just the rustling, Sheriff," she began, her voice catching as she turned to face him fully. "There's more, much more." And she knew with a chilling certainty that the wary sky above Dusty Creek was about to unleash a storm. Chapter 8. The Price of Silence. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Clara braced herself, the familiar knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She'd carried this burden for so long, the weight of her past pressing down on her, and now, finally, it was time to lay it bare. Sheriff McAllister stood opposite her, his expression unreadable, his blue eyes fixed on her face. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just waited for her to continue. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of a small clock on the wall, a relentless reminder of the passing time, of the irreversible nature of her confession. "The Blackthorn gang," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. "It wasn't just about cattle rustling. We did other things, worse things." She paused, struggling to find the words, to describe the darkness that had consumed her, the choices that had led her down a path of violence and regret. "We robbed banks," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. We hurt people. Sometimes we killed people." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but she could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment? Disgust? She couldn't tell. "I was young," she said, her voice pleading, desperate for him to understand. "I was foolish. I fell in with the wrong crowd. I didn't know what I was doing." It was a lie, a partial lie at least. She had known deep down that what she was doing was wrong, but she'd been swept up in the thrill of it, the power, the sense of belonging. She'd been running from a difficult past, from a life of poverty and hardship, and the Blackthorn gang had offered her an escape, a twisted sense of family. "There was a man," she continued, her voice choked with emotion. "His name was Silas. He was the leader. He had a hold on me. He made me believe that what we were doing was right, that we were fighting for something, for justice." It was another lie, a bigger one this time. Silas hadn't made her believe anything. She'd chosen to believe him, to embrace the darkness, to ignore the voice of her conscience. "But then," she said, her voice faltering, "then there was that night, the shootout, in Oakhaven." The memory flooded back, vivid and horrifying. The acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams, the blood staining the dusty ground. The face of the young deputy, his eyes wide with terror, staring up at her as she held a smoking gun. I didn't pull the trigger," she said, her voice shaking. "But I was there. I was responsible. I couldn't do it anymore. I ran. I changed my name. I came here, to Dusty Creek, to start over." She looked at the sheriff, her eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. "I'm not that person anymore," she said. "I swear to you. I just want to be good." The silence returned, heavier this time, filled with the weight of her confession, with the unspoken question of what would happen next. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You should have told me all this before, Clara," he said. It wasn't an accusation, not exactly. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of the trust she'd broken, of the risk she'd posed to the town. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression weary. "What am I supposed to do now, Clara?" he asked. The question directed as much to himself as to her. "You've confessed to being a part of some terrible things. You're a wanted woman." Clara's heart sank. She'd known this was a possibility, but hearing the words, seeing the reality of her situation reflected in his eyes was devastating. I, I understand, she said, her voice trembling. I'll, I'll go quietly. She turned to gather her few belongings, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind numb with despair. She'd tried to escape her past to build a new life, but it had all been for nothing. She was still an outlaw, a fugitive, and her time in Dusty Creek had just been a temporary reprieve, a fleeting illusion of peace. But as she reached for her satchel, the sheriff's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said. She turned back to him, her eyes questioning, her heart filled with a flicker of hope. He was looking at her, his expression thoughtful, his blue eyes searching. "You helped us catch those rustlers," he said. "You risked your life to protect this town." I had to," she said. "They were going to hurt people." He nodded slowly. "And you told me the truth," he continued, "even though you knew it could mean your arrest." I couldn't lie anymore," she said. "Not to you." He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze fixed on her face. "I believe you, Clara," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I believe you want to change. I believe you're not that person anymore." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to hope for it. "But," he continued, his expression hardening slightly, "the law is the law. I can't just ignore what you've done." Clara's heart sank again. She'd known it was too good to be true. "There's a price to be paid for silence, Clara," he said, his voice grave. "And there's a price to be paid for the choices you've made." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But maybe there's a way to pay that price without losing everything you've built here." He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I'm going to need your help, Clara," he said. "There's more to this than just cattle rustling. Those men, Bart and Cole, they're planning something bigger, something that could put this whole town in danger." And outside, as if on cue, the first rumble of thunder echoed across the vast, wary sky. The storm was coming. Chapter 9. Hands of Fate. The sheriff's words, coupled with the ominous rumble of thunder, painted a stark picture. Clara's past wasn't just a personal burden. It was a key to unlocking a larger conspiracy, one that threatened the fragile peace of Dusty Creek. Her help wasn't just a request, it was a necessity. "What do you need me to do?" Clara asked, her voice firm despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. The relief of not being immediately arrested was overshadowed by the looming danger, the knowledge that she was stepping back into a world she desperately tried to escape. Wyatt released her hand, his expression serious. "Bart and Cole aren't talking," he said. "They're hardened criminals, loyal to the Blackthorn gang, or what's left of it. They won't give up anything easily." He paced the small shop, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. "But you know them," he continued, turning back to her. "You know how they think. You know their weaknesses." He paused, his gaze intense. "I need you to talk to them, Clara. Get them to tell us what they're planning, who they're working with, what their target is." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. This was more than she'd bargained for. It wasn't just about confessing her past. It was about actively confronting it, about facing the demons she tried so hard to bury. That's dangerous, Sheriff," she said, her voice hesitant. "They know me. They know I betrayed them. They won't hesitate to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the image of Bart and Cole's cold, resentful eyes flashing through her mind. "I'll be there," Wyatt assured her, his voice firm. "I won't let them hurt you, but you're the only one who can get through to them. You're the only one who can speak their language." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. "I know this is a lot to ask, Clara," he said, "but I believe you can do it. I believe you want to do it, to make amends, to protect this town." His words resonated with her, stirring a sense of purpose, of determination that she hadn't felt in a long time. He was right. She did want to make amends, to atone for her past. And she did want to protect Dusty Creek, to protect the innocent people who had welcomed her, despite her hidden secrets. "All right," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'll do it." Wyatt nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "We'll go to the jail tomorrow morning," he said. "Be prepared. It won't be easy." The storm broke later that night, a violent outburst of thunder and lightning that shook the small town. Clara lay awake in her cot, listening to the rain pounding against the roof, the wind howling outside. The storm mirrored the turmoil within her, the fear and uncertainty that churned in her stomach. She thought about Silas, the charismatic, ruthless leader of the Blackthorn gang. He'd been like a father figure to her, a mentor, a lover. He'd twisted her sense of right and wrong, manipulated her into believing his twisted ideology. She'd been young, naive, desperate for belonging, and he'd exploited her vulnerabilities. She thought about Bart and Cole, the men she'd ridden with, the crimes they'd committed together. She'd seen their brutality, their lack of remorse. She'd participated in it, even if she hadn't always pulled the trigger. And she thought about Wyatt, the sheriff, the man who represented everything she'd been running from. He was a symbol of law and order, of justice and decency, and yet he was also the man who had shown her kindness, who had believed in her, who had given her a chance to redeem herself. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh, the sky a brilliant cloudless blue. But the sense of foreboding remained, a heavy weight in Clara's chest. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple, sturdy dress, her hands trembling slightly. She needed to appear strong, confident, even if she didn't feel it. She needed to project an image of someone who wasn't afraid, someone who could stand up to Bart and Cole. She met Wyatt at the sheriff's office, his expression grim but supportive. He didn't say much, just nodded, and led her to the jail, a small stone building with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. The jail was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale sweat and fear. Bart and Cole were in separate cells, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and defiance. Wyatt led Clara to Cole's cell first. He unlocked the door, motioning for her to enter. "I'll be right outside," he said, his voice low. "Call if you need me." Clara took a deep breath and stepped inside the cell. Cole was sitting on the narrow cot, his hands manacled, his gaze fixed on the floor. He didn't look up as she entered. "Hello, Cole," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. He slowly raised his head, his eyes narrowing as he recognized her. A flicker of surprise, followed by a wave of anger, crossed his face. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice raspy. "Look what the cat dragged in. Little Rose Thorne, or should I say, Clara James?" He spat on the floor, his eyes filled with contempt. "You betrayed us," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You ran like a scared rabbit." Clara stood her ground, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I left," she corrected him, her voice firm. "I didn't betray anyone. I couldn't do it anymore." He laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Couldn't do it anymore?" he repeated. "You were one of us, Rose. You enjoyed it. The thrill, the power, the money." "That's not true," Clara said, her voice rising slightly. I was lost. I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" he scoffed. "You call robbing banks, killing people, mistakes?" He leaned forward, his eyes burning with hatred. "You'll pay for what you did, Rose," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Silas will find you. He'll make you pay." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The mention of Silas, the fear of his retribution, was a potent reminder of the danger she was in. But she couldn't back down. She had to get the information Wyatt needed. She had to protect Dusty Creek. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "Silas is gone, Cole," she said. "The Blackthorn gang is broken. It's over." He laughed again, a bitter, cynical sound. "You're wrong, Rose," he said. "Silas is always watching. He has eyes everywhere, and he never forgets a betrayal." Clara knew with a chilling certainty that he was right. Silas was out there somewhere, and he was coming. The hands of fate were turning. Chapter 10. Echoes of gunfire. Cole's words, laced with the venomous promise of Silas's retribution, hung heavy in the air. Clara fought to maintain her composure, refusing to let the fear consume her. She had a task to complete, a town to protect, and she wouldn't let the ghost of Silas paralyze her. "Silas isn't here, Cole," Clara said, her voice firm, though a tremor of unease ran through her. "You are, and you're going to tell me what you're planning." Cole smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "Why should I tell you anything, traitor?" he spat. "You think you can just waltz in here after running out on us and expect us to spill our guts?" Clara took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not asking for myself, Cole," she said. "I'm asking for the people of Dusty Creek. You're planning something bigger than cattle rustling." "What is it?" He remained silent, his eyes narrowed, assessing her. She could see the conflict in his gaze, the flicker of doubt beneath the hardened exterior. He was weighing his options, calculating the risks. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, his voice defiant. "You won't stop us. We're too close." "Close to what?" Clara pressed, her voice urgent. "What's the target? The bank? The stagecoach? What?" He laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "You think we're after pennies?" he scoffed. "You always did think small, Rose." His words stung, a reminder of her past, of her naivete. But she pushed the pain aside, focusing on the task at hand. "Tell me, Cole," she said, her voice low and insistent. "Tell me what you're planning, and I'll see what I can do. I can talk to the sheriff. Maybe get you a lighter sentence." It was a lie, a desperate gamble. She had no influence over the sheriff, no power to sway his judgment. But she needed to offer Cole something, a reason to cooperate. He hesitated, his eyes flickering with a hint of hope, or was it just calculation? "You'd do that?" he asked, his voice skeptical. "You'd help us?" "I'll try," Clara said, her voice carefully neutral. "But you need to tell me what's going on." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching, probing. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, the weighing of risks and rewards. Finally he spoke, his voice low and conspiratorial. "It's the railroad," he said. "The payroll shipment. It's coming through next week. A fortune in gold." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The railroad. It was a bigger target than she'd imagined. A bolder, more dangerous plan. "When?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Where?" "The Devil's Pass," he said. "Tuesday, at noon. The Devil's Pass." It was a narrow, treacherous stretch of track, notorious for ambushes, for its vulnerability. It was the perfect place for a robbery. Clara felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and determination. She had the information, the crucial details. Now she needed to get it to the sheriff. "All right, Cole," she said, her voice steady. "I'll see what I can do." She turned to leave, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd done it. She'd gotten the information. But the danger was far from over. As she reached the door, Cole's voice stopped her. "Rose," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. She turned back to him, her eyes questioning. "Don't forget us," he said. "Don't forget what we were." It was a plea, a desperate attempt to reclaim a connection, a bond that had been shattered by her betrayal. But it was also a threat, a reminder of the past, of the ties that still bound her to the Blackthorn gang. Clara met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "I won't forget, Cole," she said, "but I'm not Rose anymore. I'm Clara." She turned and walked out of the cell, leaving him alone with his regrets, with the consequences of his choices. Wyatt was waiting outside, his expression anxious. "Did you get anything?" he asked, his voice urgent. Clara nodded, her heart still racing. "The railroad," she said. "The payroll shipment. Tuesday, noon. Devil's Pass." The sheriff's eyes widened, his face hardening with determination. "We'll be ready," he said. He called for his deputy, Billy, and gave him instructions, his voice crisp and efficient. They needed to gather a posse, to prepare for an ambush, to protect the railroad and the people of Dusty Creek. As Billy hurried off to carry out his orders, Wyatt turned back to Clara, his expression softening slightly. "You did good, Clara," he said. "You got the information we needed." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She'd done what she could, but the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. She knew this wasn't over. Silas was still out there, and the threat of his retribution hung over her like a dark cloud. She had to speak with Bart. She walked slowly toward Bart's cell. He was even more cruel than Cole, and she was afraid. As she walked, she heard the noise. At first she wasn't sure. Then it came, a sharp, echoing crack, followed by shouts, screams, gunfire. The jail. Someone was attacking the jail. Chapter 11. Confessions at Dusk. The sudden eruption of gunfire shattered the tense calm, sending a wave of chaos through the small jail. Clara's heart leaped into her throat, her instincts screaming danger. This wasn't a random attack. It was a calculated assault, a desperate attempt to free Bart and Cole. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, who was behind it. Silas. "Get down!" Wyatt yelled, pushing Clara behind his desk, his body shielding her from the hail of bullets that ripped through the wooden walls of the sheriff's office. The gunfire was intense, relentless, coming from multiple directions. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. It was a scene ripped straight from Clara's past, a terrifying echo of the violence she'd hoped to leave behind. Wyatt returned fire, his movements quick and precise, his aim steady despite the chaos. He was a seasoned lawman, accustomed to violence, but even he seemed shaken by the ferocity of the attack. "They're trying to break them out," he shouted over the din of gunfire. "We need to hold them off." Clara, crouched behind the desk, her heart pounding in her chest, felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and determination. She couldn't just hide. She had to do something. She reached for the Derringer in her pocket, her hand trembling slightly. She hadn't used it in months, but the feel of it, the weight of it, was instantly familiar. It was a small weapon, a last resort, but it was better than nothing. She peered cautiously over the edge of the desk, trying to assess the situation. The attackers were outside, firing through the windows and the door. She could see flashes of movement, hear their shouts, their curses. She saw a figure dart across the street, heading towards the back of the jail. It was a man, tall and lean, with a familiar swagger. Silas. Clara's blood ran cold. He was here. He'd come for her. He'd come to punish her for her betrayal. She had to stop him. She couldn't let him free Bart and Cole. She couldn't let him unleash his violence on Dusty Creek. "Sheriff," she shouted, her voice urgent. "Silas, he's here. He's going to the back of the jail." Wyatt, momentarily distracted by the attackers at the front, turned his head, his eyes widening as he saw the direction she was pointing. "Damn it," he cursed. "He's trying to flank us." He fired a few more shots at the front windows, then turned and sprinted towards the back door, motioning for Clara to stay put. "Stay here," he ordered. "It's too dangerous." But Clara couldn't stay. She couldn't let Wyatt face Silas alone. She knew Silas, knew his ruthlessness, his cunning. Wyatt was a good man, a brave man, but he didn't know what he was up against. She waited until Wyatt had disappeared through the back door. Then she slipped out from behind the desk, her movements quick and silent. She kept low, using the overturned furniture for cover, her senses on high alert. She reached the back door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sounds of a struggle outside, the shouts, the grunts, the thud of fists on flesh. She took a deep breath, steeled her nerves, and stepped outside, the Derringer clutched tightly in her hand. The scene that greeted her was chaotic, violent. Wyatt and Silas were locked in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, their bodies grappling, their faces contorted with rage. Silas was a powerful man, skilled in combat, and he was getting the better of Wyatt. Clara saw Silas reach for his knife, his eyes glinting with murderous intent. He was going to kill Wyatt. Without hesitation, Clara raised the derringer and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the small yard behind the jail. Silas staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand clutching his arm. The knife fell from his grasp, clattering on the ground. Wyatt, taking advantage of the distraction, lunged forward and tackled Silas, wrestling him to the ground. He disarmed him, pinning him down, his face grim. Clara stood there, her hands still trembling, the derringer smoking. She'd shot Silas. She'd saved Wyatt's life. But the relief was fleeting, replaced by a wave of nausea, of guilt. She'd hoped to never use a gun again, to never take another life. But she'd been forced to protect the man who had shown her kindness, who had believed in her. Wyatt, his breath coming in ragged gasps, looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Disappointment? Disapproval? "You saved my life, Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. I had to," she said, her voice trembling. "He was going to kill you." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her face. He knew she'd been more than just a bystander, that she'd been a participant in the violence. The gunfire from the front of the jail had stopped. The attackers, realizing that their leader had been captured, had retreated, disappearing into the dusty streets of Dusty Creek. The silence that followed was heavy, profound, filled with the weight of what had just happened, with the unspoken questions that hung in the air. Wyatt secured Silas, binding his hands and feet with rope. He then turned to Clara, his expression serious. "We need to talk, Clara," he said, "about everything." The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty yard, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. It was a beautiful, serene scene, a stark contrast to the violence that had just transpired. The dusk felt symbolic. They walked back inside, leaving Silas with the now conscious and alert Billy. And as they stepped back inside her store, Clara knew it was time. She looked at Wyatt. "I didn't just leave the gang, Wyatt," she confessed, her voice raw with emotion, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I ran because of Oakhaven, because of the deputy. I didn't shoot him, but I froze. I could have stopped it. Silas, she couldn't say it, couldn't speak of the love, the betrayal, the twisted bond she'd once shared with a monster. And as she looked at the sheriff, she finally broke, tears streaming down her face. And she was, once again, not the seamstress, not the former outlaw. She was just a scared young woman under a wary sky. Chapter 12. The Weight of Truth. Clara's raw, unfiltered confession, punctuated by sobs and the lingering echoes of gunfire, filled the small shop. The weight of her past, no longer hidden, pressed down on them both. Wyatt listened, his expression shifting from the stoic lawman to a man grappling with a complex, painful truth. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes, just let her unburden herself. When she finally fell silent, exhausted and emotionally drained, he moved closer, not to arrest her, but to offer a semblance of comfort. He didn't touch her, respecting the space between them, the unspoken boundaries that still existed. "I understand," he said, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. "More than you know." Clara looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and questioning. How could you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gaze shifting to the window, to the darkening sky outside. "I wasn't always a sheriff, Clara," he said, his voice distant, as if he were speaking to himself, to a memory. "I've seen things, done things, that I'm not proud of." He turned back to her, his blue eyes filled with a sadness she recognized, a reflection of her own pain. "I was a soldier," he continued. "In the war, I saw good men do terrible things. I saw the darkness that can consume a person, the choices that can haunt you for the rest of your life." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I know what it's like to live with regret, Clara," he said. "To carry the weight of your past. To wish you could go back and change things." His words resonated with her, a shared understanding that transcended their different backgrounds, their different paths. He wasn't judging her, wasn't condemning her. He was acknowledging her pain, her struggle, her humanity. "But you became a sheriff," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You chose to uphold the law." He nodded. "I did," he said. "It was my way of atoning, of trying to make amends for the things I'd done." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And I believe you can do the same, Clara," he said. "I believe you are doing the same." His words were a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness that had enveloped her. He still believed in her, despite everything she'd confessed, despite the violence she'd been a part of. "But Silas," Clara said, her voice trembling, he's still out there. He won't stop. He'll come after me. After everyone." Wyatt's expression hardened again, the lawman returning, the protector of Dusty Creek. "We'll be ready for him," he said, his voice firm. "We'll protect this town, and we'll protect you." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but strong. "You're not alone, Clara," he said. "You have friends here, people who care about you." His words, his touch, sent a wave of warmth through her, a sense of belonging, of acceptance that she hadn't felt in a long time. She'd come to Dusty Creek seeking anonymity, seeking to escape her past. But she'd found something more, something unexpected. A community, a connection, a chance for redemption. "What happens now?" Clara asked, her voice still shaky, but with a newfound sense of hope. Wyatt squeezed her hand gently. "Now," he said, "we prepare. We know Silas is coming. We know he's planning something. We need to be ready." He released her hand and walked towards the door. "I need to get back to the jail," he said, "to check on things, to make arrangements." He paused at the door, turning back to her, his expression serious. "Stay here, Clara," he said. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Clara nodded, her heart still pounding, but with a sense of resolve, of determination. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would face whatever came, with the help of the man who had shown her kindness, who had believed in her, who had given her a second chance. As Wyatt stepped out into the night, leaving her alone in the small shop, Clara felt a shift within her. The weight of her past was still there, but it was no longer crushing her. It was a burden she would carry, a reminder of the choices she'd made, but it wouldn't define her. She was Clara James, the seamstress of Dusty Creek, and she was also Rose Thorne, the former outlaw. She was both, and she would use both parts of herself to fight for the future, to protect the town that had become her home, to earn the redemption she so desperately craved. She had made mistakes. She had hurt people, and she knew that. She looked down at her satchel and the book of poems inside, and she knew, with a clear, distinct feeling, that it was time to make things right. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and she began to plan. Chapter 13, A Storm on the Horizon. The uneasy quiet that followed the jailbreak attempt was more unsettling than the gunfire itself. Dusty Creek held its breath, anticipating Silas's next move. Clara, confined to her shop, felt the tension coiling around her like a rattlesnake, ready to strike. Wyatt's instructions were clear. Stay put, stay safe. But inaction chafed at her, the enforced passivity a stark contrast to the proactive role she'd played in capturing the rustlers. She paced the small confines of her shop, her mind racing. She couldn't just sit and wait for Silas to make his move. She needed to be prepared, to anticipate his strategy. She knew him, knew his methods, his ruthlessness. He wouldn't attack directly, not again. He'd be more cunning, more insidious. She thought about the railroad, about the payroll shipment. It was still a potential target, even though their initial plan had been foiled. But Silas wouldn't risk another direct confrontation. Not after the losses he'd suffered. He'd find another way, a more subtle approach. She considered the town itself, its vulnerabilities. The saloon, the general store, the bank, all potential targets, places where he could inflict maximum damage, create chaos and fear. And then there was Sarah, the blacksmith's daughter, the innocent young woman who had confided in Clara, who had trusted her. The threat against her, the casual cruelty of the rustler's words, still echoed in Clara's mind. She knew with a chilling certainty that Sarah was a target, a pawn in Silas's twisted game. Clara stopped pacing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to protect Sarah. She had to warn her, to get her out of Dusty Creek to safety. She knew it was a risk, defying Wyatt's orders, exposing herself to danger. But she couldn't stand idly by while an innocent person was threatened. She had to act. She waited until nightfall, until the town was shrouded in darkness, the streets deserted. She slipped out of her shop, keeping to the shadows, her senses on high alert. She moved quickly, silently, her movements honed by years of practice. She reached the blacksmith's shop, a small, sturdy building at the edge of town. The windows were dark, the forge cold. Sarah and her father were likely asleep. Clara hesitated, her hand raised to knock on the door. She knew she was putting them in danger, drawing Silas's attention to them. But she couldn't leave Sarah unprotected, unaware of the threat that loomed over her. She took a deep breath and knocked, softly at first, then louder, more urgently. A light flickered inside, and then the door creaked open. Sarah stood there, her eyes wide with surprise, her hair tousled from sleep. "Clara," she said, her voice hesitant. "What's wrong? What are you doing here?" Clara stepped inside, pulling Sarah with her, closing the door behind them. "You're in danger, Sarah," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You need to leave Dusty Creek. Now." Sarah's eyes widened, her expression shifting from confusion to fear. "What? What are you talking about?" Clara explained quickly, concisely about the rustlers, about Silas, about the threat against her. She didn't reveal her own past, her connection to the Blackthorn gang, but she made it clear that Sarah was a target, that she needed to get away. Sarah's father, awakened by the commotion, emerged from the back room, his face etched with worry. He listened to Clara's explanation, his expression hardening with anger and fear. "I won't let them hurt my daughter," he said, his voice firm. "We'll fight them." Clara shook her head. "You can't fight them, Mr. Johnson," she said. "They're too dangerous. You need to get Sarah to safety. Take her to another town, to relatives, to anywhere but here." He hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt, with the reluctance to abandon his home, his livelihood. But he also knew that Clara was right, that his daughter's life was at stake. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "We'll leave, tonight." They packed quickly, gathering a few essential belongings, their movements hurried and tense. Clara helped them, her mind racing, trying to think of the safest route, the best destination. As they were preparing to leave, Sarah turned to Clara, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else. Understanding? "Thank you, Clara," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for warning us, for everything." Clara managed a weak smile. "Just be careful, Sarah," she said, "and don't come back until it's safe." They slipped out of the shop, keeping to the shadows, heading towards the livery stable. Clara had arranged for them to have horses to make their escape as quickly and quietly as possible. As they reached the stable, a figure stepped out of the darkness, blocking their path. It was Wyatt. Clara's heart sank. She'd been caught. She'd defied his orders, and now she would face the consequences. "Clara," Wyatt said, his voice low and disappointed. "What are you doing?" Clara stepped forward, her head held high. "I had to warn them, Sheriff," she said. "They were in danger." He looked at Sarah and her father, his expression softening slightly. "I understand," he said, "but you shouldn't have done this alone. You put yourself at risk." He paused, his gaze shifting back to Clara. "I know you're trying to help, Clara," he said, "but you need to trust me. We have a plan." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to trust him, but she also knew that Silas was unpredictable, that he could strike at any moment, in any way. "What plan?" she asked, her voice skeptical. Wyatt explained quickly, about the railroad, about the planned ambush at Devil's Pass. He believed that Silas's primary target was the payroll shipment, that he would focus his efforts there. He'd gathered a posse, and they were preparing to intercept him, to prevent the robbery. "We'll be waiting for him, Clara," he said. "We'll stop him." Clara listened, her mind wrestling with the information. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but it was also a chance to end this, to stop Silas once and for all. "All right, Sheriff," she said, her voice resigned. "I'll trust you." She turned to Sarah and her father. "Go," she said. "Get to safety, and don't look back." They nodded, their eyes filled with gratitude and fear. They mounted their horses and rode off into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Wyatt watched them go, then turned back to Clara, his expression serious. "Come on," he said. "We have work to do." And as they walked back toward the center of town, Clara noticed the dark clouds gathering, low and heavy in the sky. The storm was coming, and it would be fierce. Chapter 14. Between Two Worlds. The atmosphere in Dusty Creek shifted from tense anticipation to one of grim preparation. With Sarah and her father safely away, Clara felt a measure of relief, but the larger threat loomed, casting a long shadow over everything. Wyatt's plan to ambush Silas at Devil's Pass was risky, a high-stakes gamble that could either save the town or plunge it further into chaos. Clara found herself caught between two worlds, her past as Rose Thorne, the outlaw, and her present as Clara James, the seamstress seeking redemption. The skills she'd honed as a member of the Blackthorn gang were now being used to fight against them, a strange, unsettling irony that she couldn't ignore. Wyatt, despite his initial disapproval of her actions, seemed to recognize her value, her unique understanding of Silas and his methods. He included her in the planning, seeking her input, her insights. It was a tacit acknowledgement of her past, a recognition that her knowledge was an asset, even if it came from a dark and dangerous place. The posse was assembled, a motley crew of ranchers, townsfolk, and a few seasoned lawmen. They were armed and determined, but Clara could sense the underlying fear, the uncertainty that hung heavy in the air. They were facing a formidable enemy, a ruthless and cunning adversary who wouldn't hesitate to kill. As they prepared to ride out to Devil's Pass, Wyatt approached Clara, his expression serious. "I want you to stay here," he said, his voice firm. "It's too dangerous." Clara shook her head. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice equally firm. "I know Silas. I can help." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He knew she was right, that her knowledge could be crucial, but he also worried about her safety, about the risk she was taking. "It's not just about Silas," Clara continued, her voice low and insistent. "It's about making things right, about atoning for my past." He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just about protecting the town. It was about her personal journey, her quest for redemption. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But you stay close to me, and you do exactly what I say." Clara agreed, her heart pounding in her chest. She was stepping back into the world of violence, of danger, but this time she was on the right side. This time she was fighting for something good, for something she believed in. They rode out to Devil's Pass under the cover of darkness, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, the air heavy with the threat of rain. The pass was a narrow, winding gorge, the railroad tracks running along the bottom, flanked by steep, rocky cliffs. It was a perfect place for an ambush, a natural trap. Wyatt positioned his men strategically, hiding them among the rocks and boulders. their rifles ready. He placed Clara beside him, behind a large outcrop of rock, where she would be relatively safe, but also able to observe the scene. They waited in silence, the tension mounting with every passing minute. The only sound was the wind whistling through the narrow gorge, the occasional screech of an owl, the distant rumble of thunder. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of gray and purple, they heard the faint, rhythmic chugging of a train, approaching from the distance. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. The train grew closer, its whistle blowing mournfully, echoing through the narrow pass. It was a slow-moving train, carrying the payroll shipment, a fortune in gold. As the train entered the pass, figures emerged from the rocks, their faces masked, their guns drawn. Silas's men. "Hold your fire," Wyatt ordered, his voice low and tense. "Wait for my signal." The outlaws surrounded the train, forcing it to a halt. They began to climb aboard, their movements quick and efficient. Clara watched, her eyes scanning the scene, searching for Silas. She spotted him, standing on a rocky ledge overlooking the pass, his figure tall and imposing, his face hidden behind a bandana. He was directing the operation, his voice carrying through the narrow gorge, barking orders, his presence radiating a sense of cold, calculated control. Wyatt waited until the outlaws were fully engaged in the robbery, then gave the signal. "Now!" he shouted, his voice ringing out through the pass. The posse opened fire, a barrage of bullets raining down on the outlaws. The element of surprise was on their side, and the outlaws were caught off guard. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the pass, the air filled with the screams of men, the whinnying of horses, the clatter of falling rocks. Clara watched, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She saw several outlaws fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground, but others fought back, returning fire, their shots finding their mark. She saw one of the posse members go down, clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. She saw another stumble and fall, his rifle slipping from his grasp. The battle was fierce, brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. Clara scanned for Silas and found his figure. He was a bit separated from the ongoing fire, and she had an idea. She looked at Wyatt, who gave her a firm look, and she knew what to do. It was now or never. She had to make a choice. Stay and watch, or step in between those two worlds. And she knew. She had to act. She couldn't stay hidden. She had to face her past, and her action would define her future. Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. Clara's decision was instantaneous, driven by a potent mix of fear, determination, and a deep-seated need for redemption. She couldn't stand idly by while Wyatt and his men risked their lives. She had to confront Silas, to end this cycle of violence once and for all. "I'm going after Silas," she said to Wyatt, her voice low but firm, her eyes meeting his with unwavering resolve. Wyatt's expression was a mixture of alarm and understanding. He knew she was capable, that she knew Silas better than anyone, but he also knew the immense danger she was facing. "Clara, no," he said, his voice urgent. "It's too risky. He'll kill you. He'll kill all of you if I don't do something," she countered, her gaze shifting to the chaotic scene unfolding below. "I know how he thinks. I can get to him." Before Wyatt could argue further, Clara slipped away from their sheltered position, moving quickly and silently along the rocky ledge, using the natural cover to her advantage. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm against the backdrop of gunfire and shouts. She moved with a practiced ease, the skills she'd honed as Rosethorn resurfacing, guiding her movements. She was a shadow, a ghost, flitting among the rocks, her senses on high alert. She approached Silas's position from behind, her steps silent, her breath held tight in her chest. He was still standing on the ledge, overlooking the battle, his attention focused on directing his men. He hadn't noticed her approach. Clara drew closer, her hand reaching for the derringer in her pocket. It was a small weapon, a close-range tool, but it was all she had. She had to make it count. She was within a few feet of him now, close enough to hear his muttered curses, his frustrated commands. He was losing control of the situation, his carefully laid plans unraveling before his eyes. Clara took a deep breath, steeled her nerves, and stepped out from behind the rocks, the derringer aimed at Silas's back. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the noise of the battle. He whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He recognized her instantly, even after all this time, even with the changes she'd made. "Rose," he said, his voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. What are you doing here?" "It's over, Silas," Clara said, her voice unwavering, her grip on the derringer firm. "It's all over." He laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound that echoed through the narrow pass. "You think so?" he scoffed. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" He took a step towards her, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and something else. Was it pain, regret, or just the twisted remnants of a love that had long since soured? "I already did," Clara said, her voice steady. "I walked away a long time ago. You betrayed me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You betrayed us all. I chose a different path," Clara countered. "A better path." He laughed again, a bitter, cynical sound. "There is no better path, Rose," he said. "There's only power, and you threw it away." He reached for his gun, his movements quick and fluid. Clara knew she had only a split second to react. But before either of them could fire, another shot rang out, echoing through the pass. It wasn't from Clara's derringer, nor was it from Silas's gun. Silas staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand clutching his chest. He looked down at the spreading stain of red, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pain. He looked up at Clara, his gaze searching, questioning. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara lowered her derringer, her hand trembling. She hadn't fired the shot. She hadn't killed him. She looked around, frantically searching for the source of the shot, and then she saw him. Wyatt. He was standing on a rocky outcrop, his rifle still smoking, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something that looked a lot like love. Silas crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless, his reign of terror finally over. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They surrendered, dropping their weapons, their faces etched with defeat. The battle was over. The payroll shipment was safe. Dusty Creek was safe. Clara stood there, her body shaking, her mind reeling. She'd faced Silas. She'd confronted her past, and she'd survived. But it had come at a cost. A life had been taken, and even though it wasn't by her hand, she felt the weight of it, the burden of responsibility. Wyatt approached her, his steps slow and deliberate. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "It's over, Clara," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "You're safe." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She'd found redemption, not in the way she'd expected, but in the midst of chaos, in the face of death. She'd chosen the right path, and she'd found love, unexpected and true, in the heart of a lawman. She had one task left, one final thing to do. She looked down at Silas, and she closed his eyes. Chapter 16. Fugitive's Trail. The aftermath of the shootout at Devil's Pass was a somber affair. While the payroll shipment was secured and Silas's gang was either captured or dead, the victory felt muted, stained by the loss of life. Wyatt and his men worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded, securing the prisoners, and recovering the bodies. Clara, though shaken, assisted where she could, her medical knowledge surprisingly useful in treating injuries. The weight of Silas's death, Even though Wyatt had fired the fatal shot, pressed heavily on Clara, she had faced him, confronted her past, and in a strange, twisted way, found a measure of closure. But the violence, the bloodshed, left a bitter taste in her mouth, a reminder of the darkness she'd once embraced. As the dust settled, Wyatt turned his attention to Clara, his expression a complex mix of concern, admiration, and the lingering question of her legal status. She was a former outlaw, a fugitive from justice, and even though she'd helped save Dusty Creek, he couldn't simply ignore her past. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk about your situation." Clara nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. She knew this conversation was inevitable, that her past couldn't be erased, that there were consequences to be faced. They found a quiet spot amidst the rugged landscape, away from the bustle of activity. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the narrow pass, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. "I know I can't just walk away, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice low and resigned. "I have a past. I have debts to pay." Wyatt studied her for a moment, his blue eyes searching, assessing. "You saved my life, Clara," he said. "You saved this town. That counts for something." "But it doesn't erase what I did," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "But it changes things. It shows who you are now, not who you were then." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I can't just let you go, Clara," he said. "The law is the law, but I also can't ignore what you've done here, the bravery you've shown." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I'm going to contact the authorities," he said, "the territorial marshal. I'm going to tell them everything, about your past, about your help in capturing Silas and his gang, about your redemption." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Her fate rested in the hands of the law, in the hands of the man who had shown her kindness, who had believed in her. What will happen?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wyatt squeezed her hand gently. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll do everything I can to help you, Clara. I promise you that." He released her hand and stood up, his expression serious. "I need to get back to town," he said, "to make the arrangements." He paused at the edge and looked back at her. "Stay here," he said. "I will be back." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She was a fugitive facing an uncertain future. But she wasn't alone. She had Wyatt, and she had the memory of her actions. The knowledge that she had chosen the right path, that she had fought for something good. As darkness fell, Clara remained at Devil's Pass, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the narrow gorge, the distant howl of a coyote. She thought about her past, about the choices she'd made, the mistakes she'd committed. She thought about Silas, about the twisted love they'd once shared, about the darkness that had consumed him. And she thought about Wyatt, about his kindness, his strength, his unwavering belief in her. He was a good man, a lawman, and he represented everything she'd been running from. But he was also the man who had shown her that redemption was possible, that even a former outlaw could find a place in the world, a chance for a new life. The hours stretched on, long and agonizing, filled with uncertainty and fear. Clara huddled against the cold, her mind racing, her heart heavy with apprehension. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was ready to face it, whatever it might be. Finally, as dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of pink and orange, she saw him, Wyatt, riding towards her, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He dismounted, his expression unreadable, and approached her, his steps slow and deliberate. Clara stood up, her legs trembling slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment of judgment. He stopped in front of her, his blue eyes searching hers. He held out a piece of paper, a telegram, its edges frayed and worn. I contacted the marshal, he said, his voice low and steady. He sent a reply. Clara took the telegram, her hand trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words, her heart pounding in her chest. The message was brief, concise, but its impact was profound. Amnesty granted. Rose Thorn. Case closed. Clara stared at the telegram, her mind reeling, her body shaking with relief. She was free. Her past had been forgiven. She had been given a second chance. She looked up at Wyatt, her eyes filled with tears. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached his eyes. You earned it, Clara, he said. You earned your freedom. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. It's over, Clara, he said. You can start again. You can be Clara James, the seamstress of Dusty Creek. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the rugged landscape in a golden light, Clara knew that her journey had just begun. The fugitive's trail had ended, and a new path, a path of hope and redemption, lay before her. A path that, with Wyatt by her side, held a promise of a future she'd never dared to dream of. Chapter 17. Bonds of Trust. The news of Clara's amnesty rippled through Dusty Creek like a gentle breeze, dispelling the lingering tension and fear. The townspeople who had witnessed her bravery and her vulnerability welcomed her with open arms, their suspicion replaced by admiration and respect. She was no longer just the new seamstress. She was a hero, a symbol of redemption, a testament to the power of second chances. Clara, still reeling from the emotional roller coaster of the past few days, found herself embraced by the community, her shop bustling with customers, her days filled with the comforting rhythm of work. But it was the quiet evenings, the moments shared with Wyatt, that truly healed her, that solidified the bond that had formed between them amidst the chaos and violence. Wyatt, no longer burdened by the weight of her secret, treated her with a newfound openness, a tenderness that spoke volumes. He'd visit her shop after his rounds, sharing stories of the day, seeking her advice, his blue eyes filled with a warmth that melded the last vestiges of her fear and doubt. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, Wyatt found Clara sitting on the porch of her shop, gazing at the vibrant hues of the sunset. He joined her, settling beside her on the wooden steps, their shoulders brushing lightly. It's beautiful, isn't it? Clara said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the painted sky. Wyatt nodded. It is, he agreed. Dusty Creek has its charms, despite the hardships. They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other, who had shared a profound and transformative experience. Thank you, Wyatt, Clara said finally, her voice filled with emotion. For everything, for believing in me, for giving me a chance. He turned to her, his expression gentle. You earned it, Clara, he said. You earned your second chance. You proved who you are, not who you were. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her. I'm glad you stayed, he said, his voice low and sincere. I'm glad you're here. Clara's heart swelled with emotion. She'd come to Dusty Creek seeking anonymity, seeking to escape her past. But she'd found something far more valuable, a home, a community, and a love she'd never dared to hope for. I'm glad I stayed too, Wyatt, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He squeezed her hand gently, his gaze locking with hers. There's still things we need to talk about, Clara, he said, about the future, about us. Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what he was asking, what he was offering. It was a future she'd never imagined, a future filled with love, with hope, with the promise of a life together. I don't know what to say, she said, her voice hesitant. I've never had this before. A real chance, a real love. He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached his eyes. It's all right, Clara, he said. We'll take it slow. one step at a time. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her cheek. "But I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low and earnest. I care about you, Clara, more than I ever thought possible." Clara's heart overflowed with emotion. She'd found love in the most unexpected place, in the heart of a lawman, in the midst of chaos and violence. It was a love born of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of a deep understanding that transcended their different paths. "I care about you too, Wyatt," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "More than I can say." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that sealed their bond, that promised a future together. It was a kiss that tasted of hope, of redemption, of a love that had blossomed in the dust and the danger of the Wild West. As they broke apart, they remained close, their hands intertwined, their gazes locked. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. "I love you, Clara James," Wyatt said, his voice filled with emotion. Clara's heart soared. She'd never thought she'd hear those words, never thought she deserved to hear them. But here they were, spoken with sincerity and love, by a man who had seen her at her worst and still believed in her. "I love you too, Wyatt McAllister," she said, her voice filled with emotion. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand watching the stars, their silence filled with unspoken promises, with the quiet joy of two hearts finding their way to each other. The bonds of trust, forged in the crucible of danger and redemption, were strong and true, a foundation for a future they would build together, in the heart of Dusty Creek. The future was theirs. Chapter 18. Where the River Bends. The days following their shared declaration of love were a blend of quiet contentment and the practicalities of building a life together. Clara continued to run her shop, her skills as a seamstress in high demand, while Wyatt upheld the law in Dusty Creek, his presence a reassuring constant in the town's daily life. Their evenings were spent together, simple moments of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the growing intimacy of two hearts intertwined. One afternoon, Wyatt suggested a ride out to the river, a place he often went to for solitude and reflection. Clara readily agreed, eager to escape the confines of the town and explore the surrounding landscape. They rode out of Dusty Creek at a leisurely pace, the warm sun on their backs, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and dry grass. The river, a winding ribbon of silver, snaked its way through the rugged terrain, its banks lined with cottonwood trees and lush vegetation. They found a secluded spot, a small clearing where the river bent in a graceful curve, the water flowing smoothly over smooth, worn stones. They dismounted, tethering their horses to a nearby tree, and settled down on the grassy bank, their bodies close, their hands intertwined. "It's beautiful here," Clara said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the flowing water. Wyatt nodded. "It is," he agreed. "I come here often. To think. To find peace." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the gentle murmur of the river, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves. It was a peaceful, idyllic scene, a world away from the violence and chaos they'd faced together. "I've been thinking," Wyatt said finally, breaking the silence, his voice thoughtful, "about our future, about what we want." Clara turned to him, her heart filled with anticipation. She knew what he was leading up to, the unspoken question that hung between them. "I want to marry you, Clara," he said, his voice low and earnest, his blue eyes searching hers. "I want to build a life with you. Here in Dusty Creek." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She dreamed of this moment, but hearing the words, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, filled her with a joy she'd never thought possible. "Yes, Wyatt," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached his eyes. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their commitment, that promised a lifetime of love and happiness. As they broke apart, they remained close, their hands intertwined, their gazes locked. The future stretched before them, filled with possibilities, with the promise of a life built on trust, respect, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. "We'll need to make plans," Wyatt said, his voice practical, but his eyes filled with warmth. "A wedding, a home, a life together." Clara nodded, her heart overflowing with happiness. "I don't need anything fancy, Wyatt," she said. "Just you. Just us." He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I know," he said, "but I want to give you the world, Clara. You deserve it." They talked for hours, sharing their dreams, their hopes, their plans for the future. They decided on a small wedding, a simple ceremony with their friends and neighbors, a celebration of their love and their commitment to each other. They talked about building a home, a small ranch outside of town where they could raise a family, where they could live a peaceful, fulfilling life. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the river, they mounted their horses and rode back towards Dusty Creek, their hearts filled with joy, their future stretching before them like a golden path. But as they approached the town, they saw something that made their hearts sink. Smoke, billowing black clouds rising into the sky, obscuring the setting sun. "What's happening?" Clara asked, her voice filled with alarm. Wyatt spurred his horse forward, his face grim. "Something's wrong," he said. "Something's very wrong." They rode faster, their horses' hooves pounding on the dusty ground, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the outskirts of town, they saw the scene of devastation. The saloon. It was engulfed in flames, the fire raging out of control, the heat intense. People were running, shouting, trying to put out the fire, but it was too late. The building was a raging inferno. "Silas's men," Clara said, and her voice sounded as if she was sure. Wyatt nodded, his eyes scanned the scene. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe." He looked at the sky. The smoke was going up and up and up, and he had a terrible feeling in his stomach. It was a warning. It was a message, and he had to decode it. And as Clara stepped forward to help, he grabbed her hand. "No," he said. "This is not just an arson." Clara was confused. She looked at him, and she saw it. Fear in his eyes. "What is it, Wyatt?" she asked, and her voice betrayed her own rising fear. "It's a message, Clara," he said. "Someone wants me to see it. Someone wants us to see it." "But Silas is—" Wyatt interrupted her. "Dead?" "Yes, but he was not alone, never alone." And he looked at her, eyes somber. "We have to find out who did this, Clara. And why." Chapter 19. Facing the past. The saloon fire, a deliberate act of arson, cast a pall over Dusty Creek. While no lives were lost, the destruction of the town's central gathering place was a symbolic blow. A stark reminder that the threat hadn't entirely vanished with Silas's death. Wyatt, with Clara by his side, immediately launched an investigation, determined to uncover the culprit and bring them to justice. The initial suspicion fell on remnants of Silas's gang, seeking revenge for their leader's death. But as Wyatt delved deeper, questioning witnesses and examining the evidence, a different picture began to emerge. The arson was too precise, too calculated to be the work of vengeful outlaws. It was a message, as Wyatt had suspected, but the intended recipient wasn't just him. It was Clara. One evening, as they sat in her shop, poring over the meager clues they'd gathered, Wyatt turned to Clara, his expression grave. "I think this is connected to your past, Clara," he said, his voice low and serious. "To something beyond Silas." Clara's heart sank. She'd hoped to leave that world behind, to bury it deep, but it seemed the ghosts of her past were determined to haunt her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Wyatt explained his findings, the subtle inconsistencies, the whispers he'd overheard. The arsonist wasn't just targeting Dusty Creek. They were targeting her, specifically. They knew about her past, about her connection to the Blackthorn gang, and they were using it against her. There's someone else, Clara, Wyatt said, his gaze intense. Someone who knows you, someone who wants to hurt you, someone from your past. Clara's mind raced, sifting through the memories, the faces, the betrayals. She'd made enemies during her time with the Blackthorn gang, rivals and disgruntled former associates. But who would be so consumed by vengeance, so determined to punish her, even after she'd left that life behind? And then it hit her. A name, a face, a chilling memory that she'd tried to suppress. Corvus, she whispered, her voice barely audible, her blood running cold. Wyatt looked at her, his eyebrows raised in question. Who? Corvus Blackthorn, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. Silas's brother. I thought he was dead. I thought he'd died years ago. Wyatt's expression hardened. Tell me about him, he said, his voice firm. Clara hesitated, her mind flooded with painful memories. Corvus was a figure she'd tried to forget, a dark and dangerous presence that had haunted her nightmares. He was even more ruthless than Silas, she said, her voice low and strained. More cunning, more twisted. He was obsessed with power, with control. He resented Silas, envied him. He always wanted to be the leader. She paused, struggling to find the words to describe the darkness that had consumed Corvus, the cruelty he'd inflicted on others, the fear he'd inspired. He was involved in things that even Silas wouldn't touch, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Dark things, things that I can't even talk about. Wyatt listened intently, his face grim, his eyes filled with concern. He could see the pain in her eyes, the fear that Corvus still inspired, even after all this time. If he's alive, Wyatt said, his voice low and serious, and if he's behind this, he's a serious threat to you, to all of us. Clara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew Wyatt was right. Corvus was a force of nature, a destructive power that could unleash chaos and devastation on Dusty Creek. We need to find him, she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. We need to stop him, Wyatt agreed. They spent the next few days gathering information, piecing together the fragments of Corvus's past, searching for any clue that might lead them to him. They discovered that Corvus hadn't died, as Clara had believed. He disappeared, vanished without a trace, but rumors persisted that he was still alive, that he was building a new gang, a new empire of crime. The evidence began to mount, pointing to Corvus as the mastermind behind the saloon fire, as the architect of a larger, more sinister plan. He was using Clara's past against her, manipulating events, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. One evening, as Clara was closing up her shop, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. It was a man, tall and lean, with a familiar swagger, a cruel smile on his face. It was one of the two men who had been at the camp, the one she'd recognized. "Hello, Rose," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Long time no see." Clara's heart leaped into her throat, her hand instinctively reaching for the derringer in her pocket. But before she could draw it, he grabbed her wrist, his grip like a vice. She recognized him. Bart. "Let me go," Clara demanded, her voice trembling. "Not a chance," he said. "Corvus wants to see you. He is not a patient man." Clara struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. He dragged her towards a waiting horse, his movements quick and brutal. And there was another man holding the horse. She didn't see him well, but she knew. It was Silas's brother. It was Corvus Blackthorn. He'd come for her. "You can't do this!" she yelled at them, kicking and fighting. Corvus just stood there, a sinister smile on his face. "Oh, I can, Rose, I really can." And as Bart forced her onto the horse and Corvus mounted his steed, she knew. It was time. It was time to face her darkest past, the past she had run away for so long. And she was alone. Wyatt was far away, and she was on her own. She had to face Corvus and his demons, or die trying. Chapter 20. Dusty Creek Showdown. Clara's abduction sent a shockwave through Dusty Creek. Wyatt, returning from a fruitless search for clues, found the shop empty, the door ajar, and a single chilling clue left behind. A black feather lying on the counter, a symbol of Corvus Blackthorn's cruel and taunting presence. His heart clenched with fear and rage. Wyatt immediately mobilized the town, forming a posse, determined to track down Clara and bring Corvus to justice. He knew this wasn't just about rescuing Clara. It was about confronting a darkness that threatened to consume everything he held dear. Meanwhile, Clara, bound and gagged, was forced to ride with Bart and Corvus, their destination a mystery, her fear a constant companion. Corvus, a shadowy figure from her past, was even more menacing than she remembered. His eyes, cold and calculating, held a chilling emptiness, a void where empathy and compassion should have been. He spoke little, his silence more terrifying than any threat, his presence radiating a sense of impending doom. They rode for hours through the rugged, unforgiving landscape, the silence broken only by the thud of horses' hooves, the occasional snort of a horse, and Clara's muffled sobs. She tried to remain strong, to hold on to hope, but the fear was overwhelming. The knowledge that she was facing a man who was capable of unimaginable cruelty. As dust settled, they reached their destination, an abandoned mine nestled in the foothills of the mountains. A desolate and forbidding place. The mine, a gaping maw in the earth, represented the darkness of Clara's past, the abyss she tried so hard to escape. Corvus dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, his eyes fixed on Clara. He approached her, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Welcome back, Rose," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "I've been waiting for you." He reached out and ripped the gag from her mouth, his touch rough and brutal. Clara gasped for air, her eyes filled with defiance. "It's Clara, Corvus," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Not Rose," he laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound that echoed through the desolate landscape. "You can't escape your past, Rose," he said. "It's a part of you. It defines you." He gestured towards the mine. "This is where it all began, Rose," he said, "and this is where it ends." He unbound her, shoving her towards the mine entrance. Clara stumbled, her legs weak, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was a trap, a final confrontation, and she was facing it alone. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She would fight for her life, for her future, for the love she'd found with Wyatt. As she entered the mine, the darkness enveloped her, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. She could hear Corvus's footsteps behind her, his presence a constant threat, a reminder of the danger she faced. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, a maze of shadows and echoes. Clara stumbled through the darkness, her hands outstretched, her senses on high alert. She knew Corvus was playing a game, a deadly game of cat and mouse, and she was the prey. Suddenly a light flickered in the distance, illuminating a large chamber. Clara approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The chamber was filled with crates and barrels, remnants of the mine's former operation. And in the center of the chamber, standing beside a makeshift table, was Corvus. He was holding a lantern, its light casting eerie shadows on his face, highlighting the cruelty in his eyes. "I've been expecting you, Rose," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. Clara stepped into the chamber, her gaze fixed on Corvus. She was trapped, cornered, but she wouldn't show fear. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "What do you want, Corvus?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. He smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent shivers down her spine. "I want what's mine," he said. "I want the Blackthorn legacy, and I want you to pay for your betrayal." He gestured towards the table, where a collection of objects lay scattered, a worn leather-bound book, a silver locket, and a familiar-looking derringer. Clara's derringer. "These are yours, aren't they?" Corvus said, his voice mocking. "Reminders of your past, of your weakness." He picked up the derringer, examining it with a cruel smile. "You always were a sentimental fool, Rose," he said. "Too soft, too weak." He raised the derringer, aiming it at Clara. "But now," he said, his voice hardening, "it's time to end this, once and for all." Clara braced herself, her eyes fixed on Corvus, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the final showdown, the culmination of her past, her present, and her future. But as Corvus prepared to fire, a voice rang out from the darkness, a voice filled with authority and determination. "Hold it right there, Corvus!" It was Wyatt. He'd found them. He stepped into the chamber, his rifle aimed at Corvus, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and rage. Behind him, the posse emerged from the tunnels, their guns drawn, their faces determined. Corvus, surprised but not defeated, slowly lowered the derringer, his eyes flickering between Wyatt and Clara. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The lawman, and his little pet." He laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound that echoed through the chamber. "You can't stop me," he said. "I'm Corvus Blackthorn. I'm invincible." Wyatt stepped forward, his rifle steady, his gaze unwavering. "It's over, Corvus," he said. "Your reign of terror ends here." Corvus hesitated, his eyes darting around the chamber, assessing the situation. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he still had one card to play. He grabbed Clara, pulling her in front of him, using her as a shield. He pressed the derringer to her head, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't move, lawman," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "Or she dies." The chamber fell silent, the tension thick, the air heavy with the threat of violence. Wyatt stood there, his rifle aimed, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He had a choice to make, a choice between love and duty, a choice between Clara's life and the law. The final duel had begun, and the fate of Dusty Creek and their love hanged on a very thin, very fragile thread. Epilogue, A New Dawn. The standoff in the mine was a crucible, a test of courage, love, and loyalty. Wyatt, his heart pounding in his chest, faced an impossible choice. Risk Clara's life to uphold the law, or surrender to Corvus, allowing darkness to triumph. But Clara, despite the terror she felt, wasn't passive. She knew she couldn't rely solely on Wyatt. She had to fight for her own survival, for their future. As Corvus held her, his grip tight, the derringer pressed against her temple. She saw her chance. It was a desperate gamble, a move born of instinct and a fierce will to live. With a sudden, swift movement, she slammed her elbow back into Corvus's ribs, hard. The blow, unexpected and forceful, knocked the wind out of him, loosening his grip just enough. She twisted, wrenching herself free from his grasp, and lunged for the lantern, her only weapon. She swung the lantern with all her might, smashing it against Corvus's head. The glass shattered, the oil splattered, and flames erupted, engulfing him in a momentary inferno. He screamed, a primal cry of pain and rage, his body flailing as the fire consumed him. He stumbled backward, dropping the derringer, his hands clawing at his burning clothes. Wyatt, seizing the opportunity, fired his rifle. The shot rang out, echoing through the chamber, and Corvus Blackthorn, the embodiment of darkness and cruelty, fell to the ground, his reign of terror finally over. The posse rushed forward, subduing any remaining resistance, securing the mine, ensuring that the threat was extinguished. Wyatt, his face etched with relief and concern, rushed to Clara's side, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his eyes searching hers for any sign of injury. Clara nodded, her body trembling, her voice choked with emotion. I think so," she whispered. They held each other, their embrace a testament to their love, their resilience, their shared survival. The darkness of the mine, the echoes of gunfire, the specter of Corvus, all faded into the background, replaced by the warmth of their connection, the promise of a future free from fear. In the weeks that followed, Dusty Creek began to heal. The saloon was rebuilt, stronger and more vibrant than before, a symbol of the town's resilience and its determination to overcome adversity. Clara's shop became a haven, a place of comfort and community, her skills as a seamstress a symbol of her new life, her redemption. Wyatt and Clara were married in a simple, heartfelt ceremony, surrounded by their friends and neighbors, their love a beacon of hope in the heart of the Wild West. They built a small ranch outside of town, a place of peace and tranquility, where they could raise a family, where they could live a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of everyday existence. Clara never forgot her past, the darkness she'd faced, the choices she'd made, but she didn't let it define her. She used her experiences to help others, to offer guidance and support to those who had strayed from the right path, to show them that redemption was possible, that even in the darkest of times, hope could flourish. Years passed, and Dusty Creek prospered. The railroad brought new opportunities, new faces, new challenges, but the spirit of the town remained strong, forged in the crucible of violence and redemption, a testament to the courage of those who had fought for its survival. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the prairie, Wyatt and Clara sat on the porch of their ranch, watching their children play in the yard. Their hands were intertwined, their love a constant, unwavering presence in their lives. Clara leaned her head on Wyatt's shoulder, her heart filled with gratitude and contentment. She'd found her home, her love, her redemption in the most unlikely of places. She'd faced her demons and emerged stronger, wiser, and more deeply in love than she'd ever thought possible. "It's a beautiful life, Wyatt," she said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the vibrant hues of the sunset. Wyatt smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "It is, Clara," he agreed, "a beautiful life." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth, they knew that their journey, though marked by hardship and loss, had led them to a place of peace, of love, of a new dawn that would last a lifetime. Their love story, born in dust and blood, would be forever a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the world, hope and redemption could blossom, that love could conquer all.